Today we're going to be going over 7 movies you can watch to help you better understand race. Racial injustice is something that has been getting a ton of media coverage lately. However, that does not mean that these are new issues that we're dealing with. Particularly our Black communities in the United States have been facing injustices such as these since the foundation of the United States of America. And myself, coming from a very privileged position as an Asian American who experiences racism in a very different way, I think it is my personal responsibility to educate myself on the ways that racism impacts others so that I can help at least try to be part of the positive change that our country / world will ideally be able to see. And I think that's the case for many of us, where we must take it upon ourselves to educate ourselves and learn and empathize, understand that we will probably never be able to truly sympathize with our Black friends and peers who have experienced racism in much more visceral, different ways than us. As someone who's very vocal about how I think that media and entertainment can bring a lot of positive social change, I'm really excited to share these movies that I think do a really good job of breaking down different dynamics of racial relations and tension in the US. A lot of these films hit on different aspects of racism. I'd recommend watching all of them. A lot of them are just classics and good movies to watch in the first place. Many of them are Oscar nominees or winners. So, yeah, let's get on with the list. Movie number 1 is Do the Right Thing, a Spike Lee joint, and this follows the relations of Mookie, who's a Black employee at an Italian-owned pizza shop in a Black neighborhood. The plot of this film is really interesting because everything kind of unfolds after a confrontation with a pizza shop owner and a local patron who points out that there is a wall of only white Italian celebrities in this pizza parlor, and it sparks this discussion of, you're in a Black neighborhood, why are there no Black people on the wall, versus the owner saying, I'm Italian, it's an Italian restaurant, everything in here is going to be Italian like me. You have to watch the movie to find out. It is beautifully shot. It's Spike Lee, come on. And it just shows a lot of really interesting dynamics and how things escalate. It is just incredibly well written and nuanced, and I honestly want to watch it again. Movie number 2 is Fruitvale Station. This film is by Ryan Coogler. It tells the story of Oscar Grant III, who was a Black man in the Bay Area who was shot at the BART station, Fruitvale Station, the night of New Year's Eve. So it's based on a true story, and it goes through Oscar's day to night leading up to those events. As a warning, it is very, very graphic and triggering. I was bawling when I watched it, but it is just so important, I think, to see what happens in these events, what leads up to these events that we hear about, and the humanity behind the people whose names and faces we might see in the news, but that we don't actually have the privilege of knowing. And I think it's so important to realize that each individual death and name that we see in the news has a whole life and a history behind it. And I feel like that is really easily forgotten when you just see hashtags, names, and news headlines. Amazing movie. Ryan Coogler, he also did Black Panther. So if you like Black Panther, support Ryan Coogler. The 13th is on Netflix. I'm sure many of you have watched or heard of this at least. It's by Ava DuVernay, and it is a documentary basically laying out the history of the criminal justice system in the US leading up to the 13th Amendment and how that has manifested now in the modern era, and how slavery has basically existed throughout the entire history of the United States by being reframed or covertly included as loopholes in our criminal justice system. I know I have a lot of friends and followers who are very patriotic. They have a lot of love for their country, and I think that that's important, and I totally don't want to disrespect that, but I think it is just absolutely necessary to understand the ways in which our country needs to improve and the history that we cannot, whitewash. There is a lot of dark history of the US, and the more we know, the more that we can make positive changes in the future. 12 Years a Slave by Stephen McQueen is also a very difficult movie to watch, but really important. It is adapted from Solomon Northup's memoir about being a free man in the North during the time of slavery, when it still existed in the South, being captured in the North as a free man and turned into a slave, and having to serve as a slave without any ability to prove his legitimacy as a free man because the laws were so corrupt, because the systems were entirely against Black people, even when there was a point in time in parts of the US where slavery was no longer being practiced. It is absolutely heartbreaking to watch this film, and just so disgusting, but so real and important to understand how horribly this country has treated Black people, even in the time where there were people fighting for freedom from slavery. The next film is also based more in the modern era, and it is The Hate You Give. It's directed by George Tillman Jr., but it's based off of the book by Angie Thomas. The story focuses on what it's like to be a young black girl growing up in the current day and age at a predominantly white prep school, and the dynamics that she has to deal with in kind of having multiple identities and maintaining her blackness, her culture, and where she's from, but also trying to exist and succeed in a very white environment. And then that is completely derailed when one of her childhood best friends is shot unjustly by the police, who thought he had a weapon on him when he did not. I think for a lot of people who grow up without many friends who are black and without much connection to the black community, it's really important to understand how personally each of these deaths impacts people. I think this movie does a really good job of bringing in like the heavily emotional aspect of having to fight for systemic change when something is so personally hurting you at the same time, and when you're asked to speak up and be the voice of a movement when you're just trying to like keep it together and stay, you know, sane yourself. Really beautiful, and also very heartbreaking, but such an important thing to think about and to see. Please watch this movie. This next movie deals with race in much more subtle ways. It's definitely a main theme in the movie, but it's not really discussed so candidly verbally as the other ones, and that is Sorry to Bother You. This is by Boots Riley, and this movie, let me tell you, it's just a wild ride. I don't want to give too much away because you just have to let the magic unfold in front of you. But this movie addresses racial tensions in a lot of interesting ways, largely pointing out the microaggressions and the way that black people are oppressed in corporate life, in our corporate systems, and it really draws out like the interesting compromises of trying to be successful in America when it requires sometimes you abandoning your history, your own people, in order to conform to whiteness. I just think this is a fascinating film. It is crazy. It just gives you a lot to think about. So it's definitely more on the lighthearted side of things. If you watch that, I definitely recommend watching one of the other movies as well. And my last film that I'll suggest for anyone who wants to better understand race is Zootopia, because some of y'all really just need the children's version to break you into it, to understand the nuances and the impact of stereotype and systemic oppression, and how harmful it is to have relationships steeped in fear that has been taught to you over generations and generations. Even though this is a children's movie and it kind of takes the edge, or rather the urgency, of racism out of it because it has to be, you know, kid friendly, I think it still does encompass a lot of thought-provoking ideas and representations of racial dynamics that are important for people to know. So if you have literally never thought about race before, which I know some people have not, which is wild to me, but you know, it's okay, we all start somewhere. Watch Zootopia and read a few reviews, I don't know, like analyses of the film to get started, and then watch everything else on this list. So that is my list of films that personally helps me better understand different dynamics of race and racial oppression in the US. I hope that you guys find these helpful. Obviously, there's a lot of varying degrees of the gazes that they're choosing to look at racism in the US and the way that they're presenting it. But to me, I just think that film is an awesome medium to really be able to bring you in to that time and place. And it forces you to experience how horrific some of these things are. I know there are many more movies that are helpful for understanding race and racism and the racial dynamics, particularly in the US. If you have any suggestions, please comment those down below. Would like to expand my list. Would love for more things to watch. So I encourage you guys to watch these as just a small fraction of the way that you are choosing to engage yourself in racial conversations and in learning to be more active in speaking up and in contributing to positive change in our systems, our local government, in any organization that you might be a part of. And of course, though, it always has to start with the seed of understanding and of education.